Hi, my name is Kai Kennedy. I am the Accessibility and Inclusion Training Specialist for the City of Boston's Commission for Persons with Disabilities. And this training is an introduction to disability inclusive and affirming language titled Disabled Isn't a Bad Word. For section 1, we'll have an introduction, a brief overview of the medical versus social model, person first versus identity first language, a brief history of functioning labels, and for section 2, we'll go over euphemisms, words and phrases, and ableist language. Historically, people with disabilities have been spoken for and represented by their caretakers or the prisons and hospitals they were sent to. The language and practices used were often a reflection of the perceived burden that disabled people put on their caretakers and society versus the way that society creates boundaries to access for people with disabilities. Today, more and more self-advocates and allies are making room for disabled people to speak for themselves. And as a result, language in the disability community is evolving all the time. It's important to keep this in mind when interacting with someone from the disability community and keep an open mind. Listen to disabled people when they say that something is offensive. So I want to talk about the medical model versus the social model. These are the two main models of disability that you may be familiar with. Most people are familiar with the medical model. So this focuses on independence and the individual adapting to society. It labels disability based on deficits or abnormalities and says that disability should be fixed. Common language used may be physical impairment, wheelchair bound, low functioning, things that imply kind of helplessness. And it tends to reinforce making assumptions about someone's abilities based on their disability. The social model, on the other hand, emphasizes value of community and social and society adapting to disability. It says that disability is a difference and a normal part of the human experience. And language that is commonly used would be physical disability instead of impairment, or wheelchair user instead of wheelchair bound, or talking about support needs versus functioning labels. It also leaves room for people with disabilities to describe their individual ability and support needs on their own terms versus making assumptions, and encourages the language that disabled people feel most comfortable using, whether that's person first or identity first. So I mentioned a little bit about person versus identity first language, but what exactly is that? So person first language is when you put the person before the disability. For example, person with autism, person with hearing loss, person with dwarfism. And this language can sometimes reinforce the lack of accountability on society's part to remove the systemic barriers and provide more accessible environments. On the other hand, many persons with disabilities who prefer person-first language want to encourage others to see beyond their disability and recognize disability is not the only thing that defines their identity. They are a person above all else. On the other hand, identity-first language is when you acknowledge that a person's disability is at the core of their identity. For example, autistic person, deaf person, little person. This language is being adopted by many subsections of the disability community as it encourages accepting disability as a normal part of the human experience. Many disabled people who use identity-first language want to encourage others to recognize their disability as an integral part of their identity because it impacts how they navigate the world just as much as their skin color or gender expression. The use of disabled person and person with a disability is about 50-50 within the community. There are several subsections of the disability community that have their own best practices. For example, the autistic community generally prefers identity first, whereas many people with mental health disabilities defer to person first. But if you have any doubts at all, just follow the lead of the person you're talking to or the group that you're talking to, and try to alternate between the two if you are really not too sure. Okay, so a brief history on functioning labels. This was mentioned briefly towards the beginning of the training. You may have heard the terms high and low functioning, and typically they're used to describe autistic people with certain characteristics. Early records of the use of this term can date back as early as 1980, and it was used to differentiate autistic people with and without intellectual disability. In current language, you may hear low functioning used to describe autistic people who are non speaking or need additional support with things like dressing or bathing. And you may hear high functioning used to describe autistic people who seem to excel in school and at work and appear not to need support. But the trouble with these terms is that they do reinforce harmful stereotypes. Though non speaking autistic people tend to be labeled as low functioning, they may communicate in other ways, such as with sign language or augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, devices. And non speaking doesn't mean incapable. On the other hand, autistic people labeled as high functioning may appear to function well in school or at work, but struggle to feed and bathe themselves at home. In place of these terms, the autistic community has grown to use high support needs and low support needs. But it's still important not to assume the support needs in an autistic person. Wait for them to show and tell you. For section 2, we'll go over euphemisms, words and phrases, and ableist language. So, euphemisms. When there is a perceived negative association with the word, euphemisms are often used in place. For example, handicapped instead of disabled. But disabled is not a bad word, and it can and should be used. Euphemisms are often patronizing, infantilizing, and offensive. So here are some disability euphemisms and what you should say instead. So differently abled is something that you may have heard before. You can just say disabled or has a disability. Special needs can be exchanged for the specific need. So if the support need is they need help getting dressed, they need help with navigating their environment, they need help with eating. Those are the specific needs. Handy capable, again, just disabled or disability. Oftentimes we hear the word handicap, which is also an outdated term. However, handy capable came out of handicap to try to replace it. Disabled and or disability or has a disability can be used the same way. And special education can be accessible education. A lot of times we hear accessible education in terms of school, specifically in grade school, primary through high school. And while there may be some guidelines, so to speak, accessible education gives off the same impression. There's nothing particularly special about having access needs. So if you're wondering what type of terminology to use, there are a few points to remember. You want to avoid using language that is infantilizing or patronizing. Anything that makes a person with a disability seem like they're brave or inspirational just for being disabled. Language that makes it seem like disabled people are not normal, implies helplessness, incompetence, or reinforces a victim identity, such as wheelchair bound, suffering from, or afflicted with. And avoid language that makes it seem like disability is something to be warned of, such as red flag. Try using indication or characteristic instead. So we can help dismantle ableist practices by changing our use of common words and phrases. So instead of using the handicapped or handicap parking or handicap bathroom, we can just say disabled person or person with a disability, accessible parking, and accessible bathroom. Instead of saying insane, crazy, psycho, mentally retarded, stupid, slow, or delayed, we can say mental health disability, cognitive disability, developmental disability. Instead of saying the deaf, hearing impaired, the blind, vision impaired, has a deaf translator, is mute or a mute, we can use deaf or hard of hearing, blind or low vision, uses a sign language interpreter, or non-speaking. Instead of midget, wheelchair bound, crippled, we can say little person, wheelchair user, or uses a wheelchair, physically disabled, or has a physical disability. And finally, instead of red flag, on the spectrum, or low or high functioning, we can use indications or characteristics, autistic, and the name of the specific support need. So sometimes, even when we aren't talking directly to or about persons with disabilities, we still use language that is offensive or ableist. Phrases like fall on deaf ears, turn a blind eye, they elicit negative association with common disabilities, which can cause harm to those communities. So in this sort of word jumble, these are common ableist terms that you may hear. And I encourage you to think about different ways to say what you're trying to say. So saying something like dumb it down, can you just say, could you find another way to explain that to me? Or blind study, maybe you can say anonymous study. These are just a few of the ableist terms that you may see on a regular basis. Thank you so much for joining us for this training. If you'd like to learn more about disability accessibility, please contact the Mayor's Commission for Persons with Disabilities at Boston City Hall, room 967. Our phone number is 617-635-3682, and our email is disability@boston.gov. To stay up to date on local disability news as well as events that our office hosts, you can sign up for our newsletter by visiting boston.gov/disability and scrolling to the bottom of the page.